Hey budget gardeners, Vita Loca here. Join me today as I share with you how my backyard plant nursery did in its second year. So let's go. It is a rainy day here in New Hampshire, and I figured I might as well take you along while I pot up some plants and do other chores while we talk about how my backyard plant nursery did this year. So we're going to head into my barn, which is right over there, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about this year's nursery. We have finally been blessed with rain as well as cooler temperatures. It's been pretty hot here in New Hampshire. And so I've been spending a lot of my time outdoors in my yard. And I've been waiting for a day like today where I can just relax a little bit, do what needs to be done, which is potting up plants, and talk to you about how I did this year with my backyard plant nursery. So don't mind me while I'm working while talking. What you're looking at here, these are Shasta daisies that were in a rose garden in my yard. I didn't love the placement of them. I dug them up a number of weeks ago. They've been in this wheelbarrow. I've been watering them. I've been bringing them outside in the sun, but they desperately need to be taken out of the wheelbarrow and they need to be put into pots. So I'll just be working on that while I talk a little bit about how this year went with my nursery. Before I start, I do want to let you know that I do have a playlist of other videos related to my nursery, and I'll put a link to that playlist down in the description below in case you're interested in any other videos having to do with my nursery. This is my second year with my plant nursery. I call it a backyard plant nursery, but the nursery is actually placed in my front yard. If you come up my driveway, it's up on the right-hand side of my driveway. I love the placement of it because it's very convenient to anyone that's coming and shopping for my nursery. And they have a lot of areas where they can park their cars in case I have multiple people stopping by. I do my listings solely on Facebook Marketplace, and that has worked really well for me. My nursery is open pretty much any time that I'm home, but I do request that people set up appointments of when they want to stop by just to make sure that I'm home and also to make sure I don't have too many people visiting at the same time. Because what I've found is that many times people have a lot of questions. And if I have too many people visiting at the same time, I can't give them the attention that I'd like to when it comes to answering their questions. Some people that have nurseries at their house start off with a nursery first, and then they end up making display gardens to show what the plants look like out in the landscape. For me, I have established flower beds all around my yard, and those flower beds have been around for between 10 to 20 years, depending on each flower bed. And the reason I even created a nursery was number one, for social reasons, because both my kids are in college and I thought it would be something nice to do. Also, I love sharing my knowledge and my plants with others. It's been a great way for me to divide my plants because it keeps my plants healthy because most perennials need to be divided every 3 to 5 years. And then what I tell people is it feeds my hobby. Gardening can get expensive, and even though I do garden on a budget, I still need to buy fertilizer, I still need to buy pots sometimes, and sometimes I just want to buy some plants or seeds. So it's a nice way to help decrease the cost of all those supplies. I've learned a lot over this past season on things that I want to change for next year. And I did make a video going over my first year with the plant nursery where I went over everything that I had learned during that first year. So this video will focus more on year two and things that I've learned and things I want to change. When I first started my nursery, my plants were all very small. I love winter sowing, and I have videos that show you the process for winter sowing. I'll be sure to add a link to those too in case you're wondering what that is. And with the winter sowing process, many times your plants are pretty small. They won't typically bloom the first year, especially for perennials. So last year I had a lot of very small plants, and they fit in 3 to 4 inch pots, which was wonderful. So my nursery could accommodate a ton of plants, hundreds and hundreds of plants, because of the size of pots. Well, what I learned this year is a lot of those small plants that have not sold yet are now big plants. And even the plants that I was selling this year were too big for their 3 inch pots. So I do need to go into my plant nursery later this season, probably late summer, early fall, and I need to start potting up a bunch of my plants. And that's the reality if you do have a plant nursery or you want to make a plant nursery, is be prepared to constantly be potting plants up initially when you put them in your nursery. But then any plants that you don't sell during that season, you are going to have to divide them or just take the plants out of the small pots and pot them up into bigger pots. So potting up will definitely be something I'll be working on later this season. One goal that I had for this year, but I didn't achieve it, so hopefully I should achieve it next year, is creating tags for my plants. So there are a couple of ways that I can tackle that. I can have a certain type of plant, let's say Shasta daisy, all situated together in the nursery. And then I can have a sign that just reads Shasta daisy, the sun requirements, the height, the most important things that people are looking for when they look for plants. The color of the plant. So in this case, it would be white. But then the other thing too is I need tags for each individual plant, because a lot of times when people are buying plants and they bring it home, they don't know what those plants are. So at a minimum, they need to have the name of the plant inside each of those pots. And then they can research it on their own at home. So that is definitely on my priority list for basically this winter when it's my off season from gardening. Another thing that I learned this year was certain plants absolutely benefit from being cut back in the early season. And when I say early season, I would say probably end of May, early June. Plants that get tall and can flop over, plants that can benefit from what's called the Chelsea chop. Because what I found was I had plants that, first of all, were in too small of a pot and should have been potted up, that were flopping over. They were just too tall, too big for their pots. And had I cut them back earlier in the season, they could have been better. They wouldn't have been flopping all over the place. So that's absolutely something I need to do for next year. Something else that I want to change in my nursery is putting the plants that love sun towards the front of my nursery. And then the plants that prefer shade, putting all of those towards the back of my nursery. I didn't put a lot of thought into that when I placed plants down in the nursery. And I found that the shade-loving plants were suffering because they were getting too much sun. And then I found that the sun-loving plants were really reaching for the sun, which also was making them tall and leggy. We had a very dry, very hot summer, and it's going to continue after the next few days of rain. So I've been constantly watering my plants in my nursery. And because most of my plants are in 3 or 4 inch pots, that means they dry out faster. And that means I'm watering constantly down there. And I have a sprinkler that I set up. It's not on a timer. For next year, I'd like to get it on some sort of a timer. But for right now, I just turn it on during the early morning hours for at least an hour just to let it run. Fortunately, we have a well, and the well has, fingers crossed, never run dry. So I'm able to run the sprinkler for quite a while down there. On Facebook Marketplace, I had created one main listing, and I created, using Canva, a free tool, I created images of my plants. And I didn't show the images of what the plants look like when they're blooming. I wanted to be honest and real and show what the plants look like in the nursery in their pots. And then if I had time, I would update the listing once the plants were actually blooming. And that method worked out pretty well. But every so often, I would create an individual listing on Marketplace just to highlight a certain plant that's currently blooming. Or if I had a lot of a certain plant, like for example, Stella d'Oro daylilies, I would create a listing just for those, and I would offer a bulk discount if someone bought, let's say, more than 10 Stella d'Oro daylilies. Our average last frost date is the end of May. And here in New Hampshire, it seems like most people start looking for plants and are shopping for the perennials around the end of April, I would say. And it's pretty busy from then through the 4th of July. And I saw this same pattern last year. After the 4th of July, when the heat really kicks in, it slows down. Although I would say this year was definitely busier than last year after the 4th of July. So that was a good sign. I do like to give tours of my yard for a number of reasons. You know, I have people that come to my backyard plant nursery that found me initially on YouTube and then found that I had a backyard plant nursery. So they want to take a tour. But then also, I like to show what plants look like in the landscape just to give people an idea of what they're buying or what they could buy. And I found that people really appreciate that. So, again, if you are thinking of having a backyard plant nursery, I highly recommend that you have those plants that you're selling in your landscape so that you can show people what it's going to look like out in the landscape. I primarily still only accept cash. I know there were a few people that wanted to pay with Venmo, but generally people understood that this was cash only. And I always made sure that I had change on hand because that's very important. If you're going to accept cash only, you want to make sure that you have plenty of change on hand. We had some wood chips that were left over from when we had some trees removed on our property. So what we did was we put the wood chips down in between the walking path, and that really helped suppress the weeds. So you want to keep that in mind if you're going to have a backyard plant nursery. The weeds can get out of control very quickly, not only inside the pots of each individual plant, but also the weeds can get out of control in the pathways and the walkways. And I noticed that the wood chips really helped suppress the weeds, and therefore we weeded the nursery a lot less this year than we did last year. What I found on Marketplace is many times the price that other people are charging, if they have plant nurseries at their home, the pricing corresponds with the size of the pot in terms of the circumference of the pot. So like a 3-inch pot, the plant might sell for $3. A 5-inch pot, the plant might sell for $5. Now that's going to vary from location to location, but that's something that I noticed around here where I live. And so what that means for me is because I do need to pot up a lot of my plants into larger pots, that means that most likely my prices will go up next year because I know that a lot of these plants will not thrive in a 3-inch pot. They need to be bumped up into 4, if not 5-inch pots. And what I've found with people that come and shop here is they understand that. They know that. They know that the larger the plant, the more expensive it's going to be. And they understand that the plants are still a lot cheaper than had they gone to, let's say, a big box store or a local nursery. And also, what a lot of people have shared with me is that they appreciate the time, they appreciate the knowledge. A lot of times, I'll ask anyone that stops by to show me a picture of their space and what it looks like. You know, maybe it's a new flower bed they've created, and I can give them some ideas based on if it's a sunny location or a shady location. I don't set a minimum on how much a person needs to spend before they can make an appointment to come here. I don't know if that's common practice with backyard plant nurseries, but at least for this year, I just wanted to share that's not something that I require. There is no minimum purchase that a person needs to make. Last year, I was buying my own pots. Not all of them, but quite a few of them. I was buying them on Amazon, 3-inch pots, and I got the really cheap, really flimsy pots because I didn't want to spend that much money. And I knew that the plants only needed to live in those pots for one season. But then a friend of mine who also has a plant nursery shared with me that garden centers often will give away used pots for free. And I did find a local garden center that in fact does that. And I have been able to get so many pots, so many trays for those pots. And I just keep adding to my collection because I know that these pots are definitely stronger and sturdier than the ones that I was buying. And I'm all about reusing and recycling anyway. I think that's great. And a lot of people that come to my nursery feel the same way. In fact, a few of them are so generous that after they shop here, they end up coming back just to drop off pots for me, which I really appreciate. You can see here the Shasta Daisy are putting on a lot of new growth at the bottom. That's a good thing. That's why I'm giving them a cut back at this point, because I just want the plants to put their energy into the roots for next season. The dirt or the soil that you use can get very expensive. And I end up getting mine for free. I get it from a local transfer station, and it's basically free compost. And I just have to sift through it. My husband did make me a sifter. It sometimes has rocks in it, sometimes it has a little bit of trash in it, as well as big pieces of mulch or sticks. And I found generally that that soil has worked well for me, but I know that I probably should be adding a little bit of perlite to that mixture, because I've found that the soil is a little too heavy and holds on to the water a little too much. A lot of the plants don't seem to mind it, but I think if a plant needs very, very good drainage, it might not be happy in the type of soil. So keep that in mind when it comes to what you're using to pot up your plants. You want to make sure that it's a very good, very nice draining soil. I'm going to tell you now about the plants that are in my plant nursery, the ones that I'm selling. And as I list them off, I'll let you know if that plant has been popular or not as popular. Let's start with Baptisia or false indigo. I had collected a ton of those seeds a couple of years ago, and I did the winter sowing method, and I ended up with hundreds and hundreds of plants. I have a lot of those plants in my nursery still. Even though I have sold quite a bit of the Baptisia, I have a lot left over. So what I'm realizing is it's never good to put all your eggs in one basket, especially if you only have limited space. So I need to be more careful when I start plants from seed. I don't need to start hundreds and hundreds of any particular plant. Before I go on further, I do want to mention I don't buy in any plugs from anywhere. I either divide plants from my own landscape. My sister-in-law is kind enough to share plants with me if she doesn't need some plants or needs them thinned out. So I get divisions from her yard. And then I also start a lot of plants from seed using the winter sowing method. Echinacea or coneflower has also done very well. The tricky part with that plant is it blooms around this time, which is during the mid to late July months. And what I've found is that people are shopping for plants in the early spring months, but then they don't see a lot of things blooming. So someone has to specifically be looking for coneflower to reach out to me this time of year. Otherwise, in the spring, no one's really generally looking for like a plant like coneflower. They're looking at all the beautiful things that are blooming in the spring months, which there isn't a ton blooming during the spring months. So I try to explain what the plant is going to look like and when it's going to bloom. And usually that seems to work in terms of people wanting to buy a late summer, early fall blooming plant. And this year I only sold the purple coneflower. I have other coneflower in my nursery that I started using the winter sowing method, and everyone's very understanding. They know that some of those different varieties or different colors of echinacea are from my garden. So I'm glad that people are understanding of that, because the plant nursery is not just plants that I'm selling, it's also a holding area for myself. Speaking of which, I would love to have the nursery split up in two sections, one being all the plants that are for sale, and then another area which is solely just for my plants that I'm holding over for future projects in the yard. But that takes time and planning, but if I can get to that before next season, that would be preferred. Pulmonaria or lungwort, because that's one of the earliest things that's blooming in my yard in terms of perennials, that has been very popular. And I think it's also been popular because other people that make YouTube videos are showcasing that plant. So that seems to help. And then there are a lot of people that come here that have never heard of that plant. They've never seen the plant. So I show it in my landscape, even in the summertime when it's not blooming, but they can see how beautiful it is with its dark spots on the leaves. And that alone usually sells the plant because it looks so beautiful in the shade. Bee balm. I have had a great year with bee balm in my yard, namely the red color bee balm. So this time of year when people are coming to my nursery and they see the bee balm in its glory, a lot of people want that. And I have the red one in my landscape, but I'm also selling the light purple native bee balm, as well as a hot pink color bee balm. All of those have been very popular because they just look so beautiful blooming right now in the nursery. And as some of you may know, bee balm is a fast spreader. It's semi-invasive. And whenever anyone wants to buy a plant, I always tell them, the honest truth about a plant. For example, bee balm, it's part of the mint family. It can take over a flower bed. So be prepared to thin it out often. It's easy to dig up. It's not hard to dig up. And when I share information like that, I think people really appreciate it. Or if I share something like bee balm attracts the hummingbirds, especially the red color bee balm, that alone is information that's critical for people to know. They love hearing about which plants are pollinator magnets, which plants do the hummingbirds like. I have found that people that are shopping my nursery want to know, when do certain plants bloom, because they are looking for plants for 4 seasons of interest. Great blue lobelia. Now, that plant is native here where I live, and that's been popular either by anyone that's looking specifically for a native plant and they've heard of it being a native plant, or by me telling a shopper that that's a perfect plant that blooms in the late summer, early fall months. But I also share, again, with great blue lobelia, that if you let it go to seed and it drops its seeds everywhere, you're going to end up with a ton of little seedlings in your yard. Some people love that because they have a big space they want to fill. Other people go, oh, wait a minute, I don't think I want that plant. And then I say, well, if you deadhead it after it's done blooming, it won't drop its seeds. So just sharing information like that is always helpful. What I'm doing with these recycled pots is I'm filling it with the compost that I have, and I'm just putting 3 plants in each pot. I'll give each of these a good drink of water. Actually, I'll just bring them out in the rain, and then they'll end up going in my plant nursery. And then I have these trays, and I tell everyone, it might say proven winners. They are not proven winner plants. I just thought of a very popular plant that always does well, and it is creeping phlox. That blooms during the early spring months. And what a lot of people have told me is that nurseries bring the plant in, and then as soon as the plant is sold out, you can't find it anywhere. And that's probably true for a lot of perennials out there, but for whatever reason, that plant specifically, I hear that a lot, that it's very hard to find that plant. And well, here where I live, I have some areas that get full sun, but I have a lot of areas that don't get full sun. So I'm actually thinning out a lot of my creeping phlox from my yard, and that's been a very popular seller. The other thing that I've learned from other people is that creeping phlox can be tricky to divide. So even if they have it in their landscape, they just want more of it because they're not sure how to divide it. Ground covers in general do very well. There are always people every year that are looking for a ground cover in a certain part of their yard where they don't necessarily want to just fill it with a bunch of plants or flowers. They just want one plant that's going to cover that ground or that space. Maybe it's like under a tree or it's on a slope. So a lot of times people are looking for ideas on ground cover, and they'll let me know if it's full sun or if it's shade. And those type of plants do well. Plants such as lamium or pachysandra, bugleweed, or even vinca. And I'm always letting customers know, well, if you're going to buy a ground cover, just know that that's why it's called its name, ground cover. It's going to cover the ground. So I just warn them, don't put it in a flower bed where you also, let's say it's a small flower bed and you have a bunch of other beautiful flowers in there. It will take over. And typically people will go, oh yeah, I know what I'm doing with it. I'm good. Thank you. So that always helps, just to give them the heads up. And then we have shade loving plants. Last year, the columbine did okay. It did not do great. And the reason was that the columbine plants that I had were 1-year-old plants. They were not blooming. Only a few of them were blooming. And so unless someone was specifically looking for the plant and they didn't care that it wasn't blooming, the plant really didn't sell last year. Well, this year, the columbine put on a spectacular show. They looked beautiful when they were blooming. So those sold really well for me this year. Hosta always does well for the shade. Everyone loves hosta, so that always does well. And I have a large hosta garden, so I'm constantly dividing hosta out of that bed. And I just ask people when they buy hosta, do they have a lot of deer where they live? I just want them to know that the deer will chew down that hosta given the right conditions. Bleeding Heart was very popular this year. Last year, I only had a few pieces for sale. So I noticed that a lot of people wanted Bleeding Heart, and I made sure to have plenty more of that in my nursery this year. And I sold out of almost all of my Bleeding Heart, which is great. One thing I like to share with my customers is not to move around plants that don't like their roots being disturbed, such as Bleeding Heart or Baptisia, just any plant that has maybe a longer taproot. The daylilies always do well. The Stella d'Oro is pretty much what I offered this year, but I know that there was a lot of interest in other kinds of daylilies. So I'm not offering that yet because I'm still moving them around my own yard, trying to figure out, new areas in my yard where I want to put them. But eventually I will offer other kinds of daylilies. And the same is true for the hosta. I only offer maybe 3 kinds of hosta, but in my hosta garden that I have so many different kinds. So there was a lot of interest in the different types of hosta that I have. Heuchera, that's great for the shade. It also does well in some sun conditions. That was very popular. There were a lot of people that didn't even know what coral bells or heuchera were. But once I showed it in my landscape and what it looks like, there was a lot of interest in that. There was a lot of interest in the different colors of heuchera, and I'm pretty much only offering 2 different colors right now. Eventually, over time, I will expand that. But again, in my own landscape, I'm still dividing and moving them around in areas that I'm cleaning up, but there will be a point when I don't need that much and I can offer that for sale. Well, Shasta Daisy, I might as well mention that since I'm working on those. Those were okay. I think part of the problem with the Shasta Daisy was that they just were too tall, too leggy later in the season. Early in the season, when they were not tall and leggy, they were selling very quickly. But as the season went on, because I didn't cut them back, I noticed that the sales declined. Or if someone wanted, specifically, they wanted Shasta daisies, but then when they came over and they saw like that they looked kind of scraggly, kind of leggy, they changed their minds. Even if I told them they just need to be cut back, I get it. People want a beautiful looking plant. They don't want a tall, leggy, scraggly looking plant. Otherwise, Shasta daisy can do very well in a nursery. Iris, there was definitely a lot of interest in iris, and the only iris that I was selling was a purple colored Siberian iris. And I sold out of all of that. I know that there was interest in the bearded iris, so I did let people know that next year I should be able to offer bearded iris. One plant that I think will do better next year is lamium or dead nettle. The reason that I don't think it did so well this year was I had my lamium originally situated in a very shady area, which lamium usually does well in a shady area. But once I moved it into a part sun situation, it took off. It looked much better. So I think next year will be the year of lamium. A plant that a lot of people have never heard of, but there was a lot of interest in it, was sea holly. I sold out of all of my sea holly, and I had a ton of that. And that's another plant that does not like to have its roots disturbed once you plant it. But I showed that in my landscape, and a lot of people love that plant. But I sold out of it well before it was even blooming. It's blooming right now in my landscape. A lot of, as soon as I just mentioned that it's a blue colored flower and talked about what it's going to look like, that plant sold out very quickly. Another plant that a lot of people have never heard of but enjoyed was the stachys or betony, the humelo variety. There was a lot of interest in that. I'm almost all sold out of that plant. And I have it in my landscape, but I actually have it in a shadier area, and the plant prefers to be in full sun. So I'm going to be adding some in the full sun because I want to put it in my own yard so it looks really pretty, but also so I can show other people how pretty it is in the full sun. I have a lot of peonies in my yard, and a lot of people would ask me if I had peonies for sale. Unfortunately, I don't. That's a tricky plant. That's a perennial that, yes, you can divide it, but I just love it so much in my own landscape. So at least for right now, it's not a plant that I'm offering for sale. But if you're able to, that's a great plant that people want. And the same is true for clematis or clematis. I don't have that for sale in my nursery. A lot of people would see it in my landscape and would want it. And what I do mention to anyone that stops by and asks for either peony or clematis is that those are on the expensive side in terms of perennials. There are just certain perennials that are expensive. And so if I was to offer it for sale, it would be on the higher end. It seems generally people are fine with that. They just want the plant. Another flower that I have in my yard that I didn't offer for sale, but there was a lot of interest in it when people saw it in the landscape, was foam flower. That is something I will be offering for sale next year. During the last month, I had put out for sale on Marketplace bloodroot. I have a lot of bloodroot in my yard, and it's not a plant that you see everywhere. It's not as popular, and that's been pretty popular ever since I posted that on Marketplace. So again, a lot of people have never heard of it, and the ones that have were thrilled to see it for sale on Marketplace. Something new that I tried for this year was selling vegetables, because last year a number of people said they would love if I was to sell vegetable plants. So I had the seeds, I have the grow space indoors. I figured why not? And that was extremely popular. I'm not quite sure if I'll do it again next year, though. It's a lot of space under my grow lights. With the perennials that are in my nursery, again, they're either divisions from my yard or they're using the winter sowing method. So there was no space that I had to use under my grow lights. And typically, I like to use my indoor grow lights for growing annuals. So I just need to think a little bit more if I do want to get into selling the vegetable plants. But if I do, I think one plant that I should sell next year, because there was so much interest in it, was tomatoes. A lot of people wanted tomatoes, and I wasn't selling that this year. And in terms of a flower, the number one flower that people wanted were marigolds for their vegetable garden. So if I'm going to sell anything that has to do with vegetable gardening, I think tomatoes is the way to go, and the marigolds for those people that want them for their vegetable garden. A plant that I sold not this year, but last year, that sold like hotcakes was foxglove. Now, when you start it from seed, there are some varieties that will bloom that first year, but then there are many varieties that when you start them from seed, they won't bloom until the second year. So if I am going to sell foxglove as part of my backyard plant nursery, I think I would prefer to go after the foxglove that bloom that very first year. Otherwise, you're giving up valuable space in your nursery area just to hold over a plant for one extra season. And I'm not quite sure if it's worth it or not. I just remembered another plant that a lot of people have never heard of, but when I told them about it, they wanted it. Or people knew about it and they wanted it. I guess what I'm getting at is I sold out of this plant, and it's called Joe Pye weed. I think one of the reasons why it's popular is because of its height, especially the variety that I have is the taller variety. And then also because the pollinators love it, and the fact that it blooms later in the season. Something that I've never sold because it's a fairly new plant in my yard is the Montauk daisy. I think eventually I'd like to offer Montauk daisy as well as mums, the perennial mums. I think those would sell very well as asters for that late season interest. But I'm not ready to do that for this year, but that's my goal for next year, is to sell some of those late blooming perennials that people would enjoy. Something new that I offered this year that I didn't offer last year was sedum, just the autumn joy sedum. That was very popular. And I think going forward, I'll have to increase how much of that I'm selling, especially the different colors and the different height of sedum that are out there. Sedum seems to sell very well. Fruiting plants. So much interest in fruiting plants. A lot of people asking me about blueberries. It's not something that I offered. I do have blueberry plants in my yard. I'm not sure if I would offer it next year, but I know that the interest is there. The same is true for strawberries. I did offer strawberries this year, and those did sell. But what I've learned is I really need to get the strawberries planted in pots, ready to go in the early spring months. A lot of people looking for herbs. I have lavender. It wasn't for sale. There was a lot of interest in lavender. My basil sold out. My cilantro sold out. So those are plants that I will most likely offer next year because I'm growing them anyway for myself. What's an extra couple of seeds thrown into a pot? So I figure it's worth it for me. I had some grapes that I had dug out of my raised vegetable garden in the backyard because I decided I didn't want those, and those sold very quickly. One area that I don't know a lot about are the plants that are the medicinal plants, as well as the native plants. Now, native plants will vary from area to area, so it's a matter of me knowing the native plants for my location here in New Hampshire. But I feel like that's very tricky. That could be its whole, you could just have a backyard plant nursery full of native plants. And you really need to know what you're talking about, I've found, when it comes to medicinal plants or native plants, because there are a lot of people out there that really know their stuff. So if you're going to sell quote unquote native plants, you want to make sure you're well versed in that area. So for me, if someone says, do you have native plants? I will just give them a list of what I think is a native plant, and then I'll let them correct me, but I'll let them know that I'm not well versed in that area, that I just believe these are the list of plants that I have that are considered native to this area. I have to tell you, I'm glad I'm spending the time chatting with you about this topic because it's been on my mind for a long time, and I've had a number of people ask me to do an update video. So I'm really glad that I'm doing this, and I welcome any questions, any comments that you have. I'd love to know if you have a backyard plant nursery and how you did this year. Maybe you can share some tips with other people that are interested in having a backyard plant nursery, or with other people that have one right now, because I think we all can learn from each other. And then I'd love to know if you want me to do these type of videos more often. It's hard with YouTube. I don't know if most of the people that subscribe to my channel are subscribing because they want to know more about the backyard plant nursery, or if they want to know more about how to collect seeds from flowers, because I do videos based on whatever it is I'm doing in the yard. And the backyard plant nursery is a huge part of what I do, but this is only my second year, so I'm still learning a lot. Whereas when it comes to just my own flower beds in my yard, I've been gardening for 30 years, so I tend to make a lot more of my videos based on projects in my yard. So please let me know down below in the comment section if you want more frequent updates on how to run a plant nursery and what I'm doing with my plant nursery each month or something like that. I hope you're able to get out in your gardens. And until the next video, make it a great day with gardening.